Hi folks, today we're going to be talking about a subject that has been a fascination for me since I was about 5 years old. The case for Bigfoot, here on Lessons from the Purple Chair. Hi folks, and welcome back to Lessons from the Purple Chair. One intellectual's musings from a big purple wingback. I'm your host, Professor Timothy Big Pretty Crowe. All right, folks, this is my first installment on this channel, and I'm very excited about it. And one of the reasons I'm most excited is I'm going to be going over a topic that has absolutely fascinated me since childhood, since about 5 years old. And that, of course, is the legend of Bigfoot. When I was a little kid, I was obsessed with Bigfoot. You know, everything was about Bigfoot. I wanted to find Bigfoot so bad. I was completely convinced that he did exist. That Bigfoot was a true living creature. And I used to beg my father to take me to hunt Bigfoot. Because we lived in Ohio at the time, I thought all Bigfoot were in the Pacific Northwest, and I kept wanting him to take me to Washington or Oregon or California. It didn't happen. You know, but that didn't stop the fascination. As I said, I was very convinced when I was younger it was real. Now, as I've gotten older, more educated, I've had my criticisms and doubts over the Bigfoot phenomenon, and we're going to go over it all here now. Now, first, let's start off with the legend of Bigfoot and its history. It's called Bigfoot now, and that started in the 1950s. But Bigfoot was known in the legends and folklore and mythologies of the Native Americans for thousands of years. We have found stone carved heads along riverbeds in the Pacific Northwest that have been carved to look like almost like an ape-like face. You got to consider that there are no indigenous primates in North America. You know, you could say human, but even we came here, you know, crossing the land bridge back in the Ice Age. So the fact that these Native Americans were carving something which, at least to our eyes, looks like an ape-like face, an ape, is very interesting. And within the Native American legends, pretty much across the United States, you find a lot of different names for this mythical creature, which is usually described as a large, hairy wild man. So it goes by such names as Oma, of Bukwas, of Chiatanka, and of course one of the most famous, also Skookum, but one of the most famous, of course, is the Salish Native American name for it, which the anglicized version is Sasquatch. And Bigfoot, especially since the 1980s, has become more known by both names, Bigfoot and Sasquatch. There was a lot of within these legends, and they do vary. You know, we find that this creature usually is seen as some sort of guardian of the wood, some sort of devil of the wood. The Sasquatch, doesn't always have the best reputation in Native American myths. He's said to either, to want to steal young maidens away, or steal away children. Also would, steal food. So he's kind of a Native American boogeyman in a lot of these myths. Also, it has to be noted that in these myths, which isn't often spoke of by Bigfoot experts, is that in these myths, it's not exactly like the Bigfoot people think of as this big skulking bipedal ape. But, in those legends, often he wears clothes, he makes canoes, he talks, and he does seem to have a fascination with Native American women. Just can't blame him there. There's some beautiful women. But there's a little bit more to it than, and there's a lot of very generalized association, and people trying to fit this Native American legends into the sightings of this bipedal, this bipedal giant ape, that's primate that's been seen in North America, at least has been proposed to have been seen. But one cannot ignore that these myths exist, and all of the names through all of these Indian nations for this creature, they all translate to a tall man of the woods, woodsman, stick man, guardian of the woods, boss of the mountains, wild man of the woods, which is Sasquatch. So one can't ignore that, and the fact that they do add these stories of talking and dressing and canoe making Sasquatch. Well, they've had similar stories about coyotes and ravens and bears. This anthropomorphizing animals and myths is very common. So we have to add in that if there is such a thing as Sasquatch, this big bipedal ape skulking around in the woods, rarely seen, that in their myths they would add these type of anthropomorphic elements in their stories. So I don't think it does count it out. Anyway, a lot of people feel that the Bigfoot phenomenon started in the 1950s after the abominable snowman legend started coming out from explorers in the Himalayas. However, that's not quite true. If you go back into the early settlements of North America, excuse me, you find that you find these stories here in North America as well, going back at least to the early 19th century. A gentleman named Elkanah Walker, who was a missionary to the Spokane Indians in 1840, reported in a letter in April of 1840 about a race of giant hairy men that lived very much like the biblical giants who lived in the woods, was commonly heard by the natives, who had a horrible smell. And more interestingly, and this will come up later, is that he described the footprints. It said that their footprints were 1.5 feet long and nearly as wide. Well, that's very similar to the footprints that would start popping up, and being made casts of in the mid 20th century. And I think that is significant. Also, if you get into the early 20th century, you start finding these legends of what a lot of the mountaineers and prospectors called Injun devils or mountain devils. And we have a couple of famous cases in the early 1920s, particularly in 1924. In Washington, a group of prospectors, one of which was Fred Beck and Leroy Smith, one claimed to have shot one of these creatures when they was out working, and that night they claimed that their cabin was attacked by a group of these Injun devils, these big hairy giant Injun devils who rained rocks and beat on the walls, apparently angry that one of their own had been killed. And since then, that area where the cabin was has been known as Ape Canyon, and is still known as Ape Canyon. Also in that same year, a man named Albert Osman claimed that he had been abducted while camping. He was prospecting in the area, and in his sleep, something had picked him up in his sleeping bag, which luckily he had a little bit of food stored in the bottom of his sleeping bag to keep animals from getting for it. And it carried him for 3 hours to this canyon area, and where he sat, there was like 3 or 4 female. There was like 2 females and two adolescents, and this large creature, which by his descriptions does fit for Sasquatch. It said a 7 to 8 foot hairy bipedal primate. This big giant, hairy man. And it kept him. He stayed with them for 6 days before he managed to escape. So we have a lot of early stories about these creatures, and they had been known before they became famous. Now, when they became famous was, of course, in the 1950s. There was a logging crew up in Northern California near Bluff Creek that These men, they just opened this area up for logging in 1958 and 57, 58, and the loggers started noticing these huge footprints around their equipment when they come back in the morning. Some of them 14 inches long to 7 inches wide, big footprints. They also started noticing that fuel drums weighing 300 to 400 pounds have been tossed around, almost like they were beach balls. Just tossed around like nothing. Some of them thrown, not dragged. And they started, and they also mentioned being spooked, feel like that the woods would go quiet and that they felt like they were being watched all the time. So finally, this crew's foreman, a man named Jerry Crowe, took a plaster cast of one of these footprints. He got an article and picture in the Humboldt Times newspaper, and that got carried by the Associated Press, and that's where the legend was born. And in that interview, he said the men had been calling them those things with the big foot, and Bigfoot. So from there on, once it spread, this news story went out, the name Bigfoot was born, and the phenomenon started. And quickly, the nation got a fascination with the Bigfoot phenomenon. Was there really these creatures out there? Suddenly, people started coming forward, people who had said they'd been afraid to say so before, reporting that having seen these creatures. And the creature descriptions are fairly consistent. The description of a Sasquatch or Bigfoot was usually a very large primate type of animal, standing bipedal, walking like a man, not down on all fours like a gorilla or a chimpanzee. Covered in hair, and the hair is usually described as either a very dark brown, kind of a cedar or chestnut brown, sometimes black, sometimes a grayish color. The hair usually not shaggy, but being maybe 1 inch to 2 inches long across the body, thinner in some spots, having a conical shaped head, which obviously shows a sagittal crest like you find with great apes like the gorillas. But the face is always described as having very little hair and being more human-like than ape-like, not protruding at the mouth or flayed nostrils at the nose. The nose is much more similar to humans, usually with dark eyes. Most of the sightings describe a male, and they're usually said to be huge, standing between 6.5 to as much as 8 to 9 feet tall, 7.5 feet tall being average, with a shoulder span of up to 3 feet. So you're talking about a massive, giant creature. And the footprints started showing up in the casts all over, specifically in the Pacific Northwest. You started getting all of these footprint casts, and they are fairly consistent. They're these long. They have a long heel, shorter part of the ball of the foot. Just these massive footprints. And by now there have been hundreds of casts and photographs taken of these footprints. Now, the most famous incident in the Bigfoot world, which is still causing controversy, is still under examination, is still hotly debated, would be the Patterson-Gimlin film. In October 20th, 1967, Roger Patterson, a cowboy and a Bigfoot enthusiast, and his friend Robert Gimlin, who was also a cowboy, a man that worked on horseback, they both went out, and they commonly have been doing on long rides through Northern California, looking for evidence of Bigfoot. They had an interest. Roger had actually written a short book, mostly a mixture of different newspaper articles on the subject, and they would commonly go out. And this day they went out into a spot known as Bluff Creek. And Bluff Creek is way out in Northern California. It's about 50 miles from the town of Willow Creek, kind of the Bigfoot capital. And this is the area where there have been a lot of sightings, not far from where the logging crew had made their first reports. Now, so The story goes that they were rounding a bend in the creek. Now, there had been a huge flood about 2 years earlier, so it really knocked a lot of the trees down. It was a lot more, a lot more accessible and, a lot more visibility. As they went around this creek with all this debris from this flood, they went around a tree that had been fell over, and the roots all sticking up. And they come around the side of that. They claim to have seen a Sasquatch, a Bigfoot, standing by the side on the other side of the creek. Well, the horses reared. Roger managed to grab his camera, jumped off his horse. This supposed Sasquatch looked at them, and apparently had no interest in whatever they're doing, and started walking away from them. Roger ran within about 50 feet, and while filming. You see the camera jumps, and he caught about 53 seconds of this so-called Bigfoot walking away into the forest. Now, this film, it was in color, has been disputed and examined and called a fake and declared legitimate over the last 54 years, and they're still debating this film. Now, I would love to go into more depth into this film, but I've decided, because I have so much to say about the Patterson-Gimlin film, that I'm going to wait and do a separate video about it, where I'm going to really break it down and examine it, because I've been looking at this thing for over 40 years, and I definitely have some opinions. But for right now, I will say that if this was faked, that is the best costume I have ever seen. It was not something a bunch of cowboys could have ordered offline back at the time or made themselves. This is just too good. The hair, the slickness of the hair looks like wild hair rather than being shaggy and all that like you see with the costume. The gait, the face, it's just too good to be amateur. It had to be professional. Then it comes up, well, who was the amateur that who was the professional that made this? And like I said, I'll stop there. We'll go into that much at another date. So now, let's talk about the kind of the evidence for a Sasquatch. One, we do not have any skeletons or bones, and that's one of the biggest criticisms we get from the scientific world. If these things exist, where are the bones? Why has one not been captured? Why has one not been killed? Well, to that I can say, and I have to agree that is a major deterrent, and a case for it not existing. However, not finding bones is not surprising. If this animal is real, it would be very rare. Maybe one for every 200 bears out there, as Grover Krantz once said. And and in truth, I grew up in the woods. I grew up, in the Appalachians, and one point you can say is like, how you ask any hunter, how many bears or how many cougars or wildcats have you ever found that died a natural death? Most will say zero, because things that die naturally. One thing, animals like to hide when they die. They'll burrow their hide when they die, if they're dying of natural causes, or if they happen to be killed. They're usually consumed very quickly. Vultures move in quick. The other scavengers move in quick. They do not last long. And then the bones, they can be eaten by squirrel. They'll be chewed up by squirrels or porcupines in certain areas. So they disappear pretty quick. So, like for me, I've walked around and lived in the woods all my life. I never once found a bear that died. I never once found even a possum that naturally just died. Because these things just don't last. So for an even more rare animal, if you haven't found the first dead bear, finding a very rare animal, it's almost, the possibilities is not even worth considering. So you got to give them that. Then of course it comes down to the issue of, well, in North America, how can a 7-foot bipedal great ape hide from man? Well, I would say in most of the more populated lower 40 states, it would be very difficult. However, and you get into places like the Pacific Northwest, particularly Washington State, Oregon, and Northern California, and then moving up into the border in Canada. There, in the area between Northern California and those three states and British Columbia, there are over 25,000 square miles of wild timberland. Thick, wild timberland that is rarely crossed by man. And if you've ever been to the Pacific Northwest and walked out into some of those massive wildernesses, you realize pretty quick anything could live in there. Whole tribes of people could live in there. I know that movie Last of the Dogmen where there was a tribe of Native Americans hiding there. I can believe that. I mean, you walk out into these woods and it can be broad daylight, at noon, bright sunny day. You step in there and it's dark. It's so canopied over, covered in moss and thick forestry. Anything can be living in there and almost never be seen, almost never to rarely be seen. That I could completely buy. Now, I have a little more issue when you get into the more populated areas. There's been Bigfoots reported in New York State. Now, yes, there's a lot of forest in America, and it is possible. It's also much more highly populated. And I think that if you had something as a population, it can't just be one or two, a population of something like Bigfoot out there, that they'd be more commonly seen. And not only that, they're scat and their tracks more commonly seen. You don't find that. However, in the Pacific Northwest, where this legend began, I can see it completely possible. I think the rest could be more of a legend passing on and people thinking they see this or faking that they saw it. But I'll leave that alone for right now. Now, so another part of the evidence that you find is, of course, the footprints. And actually, the footprints are the best evidence that we have. Because particularly one particular set of tracks that was found in Bousberg, Washington, and they are known as the Bousberg tracks. These are a set of tracks by which one of the feet was deformed, missing a toe, and bent crooked, which would be something, maybe it was injured, perhaps disease, or this creature had been injured in its youth, and this is how the foot had developed. But it'd be something very natural that you would expect to find, on occasion. These tracks were found around a dump, a woodside dump, hundreds of them all over the place in the snow and in the mud. And when the tracks were copied, where casts were made, Dr. Grover Krantz and other an anthropologist out of Oregon, when they looked at it, they found the mechanics, that would take for a 7 foot, possibly 500 to 800 pound animal to walk upright. You have a longer heel, shorter forepart, and also there was a gap in these casts that shows a gap in the bones, and that's exactly where the bones should be to carry an animal that size. So to think that someone faked this, they'd have to have a real genius imagination and knowledge of the anatomy of the foot and of bipedal locomotion. That doesn't seem likely, but not impossible. In fact, it's been said that those particular tracks are a much better proof than the Patterson film. Now, while I'm on the footprints, we'll also talk about the hair samples. Now, there have been a lot of hair samples found that were claimed to be from a Bigfoot. Now, a lot of them, when they're tested, they turn out to be human hair, bear hair, deer hair, other types of animal hair. But in several cases, they found that these hair samples do not match any known specimen, and that they are much closer to human hair or gorilla hair, primate hair, but different in ways from them. But now here's the thing: you think, well, that's some pretty solid proof, and it is. But in science, there is a kind of a catch-22 loop. Is that if you have a sample that you cannot identify, that does not match a known specimen, then it must remain unidentified and thus cannot be seen as proof. You have to have, so basically to prove that these hairs come from a Sasquatch, you'd have to have a Sasquatch. So it's kind of this loop that never ends. But you have to ask, these hairs are coming from something, unless there's a primate hair tree out there blowing it around Pacific Northwest and across America. These hairs have been grown on some sort of primate that we have not identified, and that's hard to get around. Also, back on the footprints, something that was discovered was that in some of on the better footprints, we find very intricate dermal ridges, just like you find in your fingerprints and your toe prints. However, one investigator for the FBI, who was an expert not only on human footprints and fingerprints, but also on, as a hobby, he investigated primate footprints, such as chimpanzees and gorillas. He started noticing that these dermal ridges found in these footprints, when he examined them, were all very different from those. They were much of these longer striation type of prints, and but what was more interesting was that when he started looking at across the prints, some of these plaster footprints made decades apart, hundreds of thousands of miles apart. He would find always these same ridges and the same types of patterns, which is very different from human or chimpanzee or gorilla. It had its own signature type, and he found these, like a track made in 1960 in Washington would have the same type of dermal ridges as as one found in the 1950s in Northern California or Oregon. So that's some powerful evidence that all of for decades, all these different prints and different spots, but yet they have the same type of dermal ridges. It's something to think about there, huh? So and those are and of course then you have the sightings, and at this point there have been thousands of sightings. Hundreds, usually a couple hundred a year. Mostly concentrated in the state of Washington, which has the highest. Some in Florida, which they have the skunk ape down there, and of course, not just Washington, but also Oregon and Northern California, where the whole thing kind of started. So now let's talk about really quick the possibility from the fossil record that such an animal could even exist. Is this something that's just pure fantasy that cannot exist from the record book of animal evolution on this planet, or is it something that's a possibility? And now you'll hear some scientists say this thing, there is no type of creature in the fossil record. It doesn't match. That's bull. That is not true. There was a great ape, actually the largest primate that's ever lived, that's been called Gigantopithecus blacki. And Gigantopithecus blacki was a giant ape that lived in China, and it died out about 300,000 years ago, so within human times. And this ape, which we've only found a few, like 2 jawbones and a lot of teeth, big teeth for it. It's estimated to have stood about between 8 to 10 feet tall. Had about a 3 to 4 foot shoulder span. Probably weighed in excess of 800 pounds. It's just a massive great ape. Was probably an opportunistic omnivore, mostly living on vegetable matter, especially like roots, berries, things like that. And it definitely did live in China. And really, this is a very similar description of the modern Bigfoot or Sasquatch. And actually, what's interesting about this is that if you look at where the Gigantopithecus lived in China, you draw a line across the map, across to North America, you'll find that every place that this creature could have migrated and lived, you have a legend of a giant wild man. From the Yeti, well, actually, even in China still, there's the Yeren, the wild man, which is pretty much a description of a Gigantopithecus. In the Himalayas, you have the Yeti, or known as the abominable snowman. Then, of course, into Russia, you have the Amisti, which is pretty much the same thing, a big hairy wild man living in the woods. And then, of course, you have the land bridge from the Ice Age that would have crossed into North America, and you have the Sasquatch, the Bigfoot. It's interesting that the very places that this thing could have lived and could have migrated, almost in a line, is where you find these legends. I find that interesting, circumstantial evidence, and something that shouldn't be just discounted. Now, one thing about Gigantopithecus blacki, which has been a debate, was this animal bipedal? Thus far, humans are the only bipedal primates. All other forms of primates walk on all fours. Now, it's not impossible for gorillas and chimpanzees and orangutans to walk up on two legs, but they're a little clumsy, and it's not their normal locomotion. So did this Gigantopithecus blacki walk upright? Well, according to Grover Krantz, the late Grover Krantz, who was one of the top anthropologists that would actually consider the Bigfoot to be possibly real, he gave the argument that the jaw bones that have been found, because we don't have any other bones. We have a pelvis bone that would prove it, but we don't have a pelvis bone. But he said that the jawbone that's been found is rather narrow rather than wide. And if you look at apes, because they do walk on all fours, their heads hang down more like this, more hunched. So when they walk. Whereas humans, if you hold your head straight up, you'll see that your jaw is above your shoulder, because the spine is more straight up. Now, the fact that he says that makes our jaws much more narrow, much more wider than than an ape's jaw, which is much more narrow. It's to make room for that neck and spine. So you see that wide spread in the Gigantopithecus blacki jaw, and that's an argument that its head set upright, its spine was straight, meaning that it was bipedal. Now, this has been debated by a lot of primatologists and anthropologists, saying that that's not very flimsy evidence for bipedalism. So the debate remains: did this thing walk on upright or on all fours? It is most closely related to the orangutan, and of course, orangutans can walk on two feet, but they are actually tree climbing primates, and when they do walk on the ground, it's almost always on all fours, on their knuckles. So that's something to consider. Now, a couple of things that kind of work against these legends being true, against the existence of a Bigfoot or Sasquatch. One, yes, because of the area. They live in North America, a place of 300 million people. There, and it seems very unlikely that such a large creature could live and exist without being spotted more often or having been killed, with all the hunters out there, the deer hunters and all that. If the one hasn't been shot and killed, and the specimen has been brought in, that they won't see more often. But once again, if this is a primate, it's a very intelligent primate, and it knows how to hide. And it's got plenty of room to hide. There's so much forest land in America, especially in the Pacific Northwest. As I said, we got 25,000 square miles that's a thick forest where it'd be very easy for it to hide. You also should remember that the mountain gorilla was believed to be a myth till 1911. Until finally one was shot and killed. 1911, people thought that the locals talked of it as the big hairy man that lived out in the jungle. And everybody thought it was a myth until somebody brought one in. That 1911 had been around that whole time in a very populated area. So it's not impossible that an intelligent primate could hide from us. Especially if it has the room. And when you're out there, you're in its territory. It knows how to hide and how to stay away. Now, which that does kind of fit with the behavior that we see with the Sasquatch. They're usually said to be very shy. They don't make a lot of noise. When they are seen, they're usually watching us do something, or it's accidental. They're crossing a road, something like that. And when the minute they're seen, they disappear quick. They're out of there. And apparently they can move with a real grace through the woods and just vanish. Something also kind of backs up the Patterson film, I think, because that thing is moving very gracefully on some very rough terrain. I'll get into that in the next video. So now so that's one thing, but that is something against it, is that this thing's in America, and when one of them is seen near New York City, I'm a bit of a skeptic, to say the very least. Another big one, and this is the biggest one for me, would be the habitat and whether it could sustain such a large creature. If a Bigfoot exists, you're talking about probably an 800-pound, 7-foot primate. That requires a lot of energy and a lot of food. And I just have problems seeing, especially alpine forests, having enough resources to keep up even one, let alone would have to be a population of maybe 2,000 living between British Columbia and North America. That's a lot. The average gorilla eats 40 pounds worth of food a day, and a Bigfoot would need that type of sustenance. And of course, they live where there's plenty of sugar cane and all this other thing for them to eat. Food like that is not going to be found in these alpine forests of the Pacific Northwest. Now there are plenty of roots and berries, salmon, fish, and small game. So it is possible, but to me it seems kind of unlikely. However, I will say another proof to me for our argument that there is a Bigfoot is that the description of its anatomy, to me, is answerable. For instance, it is so huge and so large. Well, that may be answered by this conical head. The conical head or sagittal crest on the top of a great ape is for one thing, and that is for those massive muscles that work the jaw. They're hooked in the jaw for these massive muscles. And the reason, which gives it a very powerful jaw, the reason it needs a powerful, gorillas need a powerful jaw, is because they are usually eating things like tubers and tougher vegetation, roots and cane and things like that. And that's where they're getting their most of their nutrients. So they need those massive jaws to chew that stuff up, But that would also answer if a Bigfoot has the sagittal crest, obviously it has the jaw, which tells us part of its diet. It is obviously, the majority of its diet, though it's likely an opportunistic omnivore, gets what it can. It's mostly living. Staple food would be roots and harder chewed vegetation. And with if you have that type of diet, you have to have a large digestive system, a lot of guts, a lot of bowels to process that hard fibrous material and get the nutrients out of it. So that would answer for the size. You have to have a big body to house all those guts. It's reason like cows are so large and other things, because their stomachs are made to process more of this tougher vegetation. And for an animal that's digesting thick roots and cane and things like that, it would need that type of so that's the reason you got that big body and that big digestive system. So that would, the size and the sagittal crest answers for its size. So but once again, that's a lot of food that would be needed for such a large creature, and I have a hard time seeing them being able to get it in North America, especially in the alpine forests of the Pacific Northwest. So to me, that is an argument against the Bigfoot, but not completely can be ruled out. There's in the last few years, there's been a lot of speculation that maybe the Bigfoot hunts. Suddenly he's turned into a carnivore and hunts deer. Well, that kind of goes against its physiology, and I don't think it's going to be quick enough to be catching deer. So I think that's going a little bit too far. The behavior, though, of these supposed creatures does match that of other primates. For like gorillas or chimpanzees. They're usually very shy and very reclusive. They're also more of a family unit. They like all primates. We are a group type of creature. We're a social creature. Seems that the Sasquatch is the same way. They do avoid man. They do seem to communicate through howls and hoots, and these loud pitch howls have always been described and associated with the Sasquatch and the Bigfoot. Some very bone-chilling recordings have been made in the Pacific Northwest. Also, we have the reports of tree knocking, like something taking a stick and beating inside of a tree. Well, chimpanzees are known to do this. They're known to beat the sides of trees with sticks, one to establish their territory, or to signal to their group that they're in distress or something's going on, or usually to give a warning to others that you're getting too close to our territory and our group. So that is very much in keeping with the howling and the tree beating are very much in keeping with primates, with primate behavior. But and there is actually one case that I always like to cite, and that is there's a case of this hiker, and this completely baffled him. He started hearing knocking, and as he walked along this trail, and these tree knocking, and he started hearing a few little grunts. He kept walking along. He didn't know what it was, and all of a sudden, off the hillside, this thing come tumbling down. What he thought was a bear at first. Come tumbling down and landed on the walking trail not far from him. And then then all of a sudden arms started coming out and it stood up to be this 7-foot hairy, basically a Sasquatch. And it looked at him and then turned and walked up the trail. Well, this guy walked on up the trail too, not knowing what to do. And up ahead, it had squatted down. It was standing on the trail, and it was tapping a stick on a log, and looking at him, kind of side-eyeing him. And he's like, "What?" All of a sudden, this thing stood up, looked at him, and started running at him. And he took off running. And he would look back, and the thing would be running after him, never catch up with him. He said it was very obvious this thing, he could have overtook me at any time, the way quick as it moved and as big as it was. But it never did. And he said, when I would stop, it would stop. And then it would run at him again, and he'd take off running and look back. And when he'd stop, it'd stop, look at him, run at him again. And it finally, until he run on down the trail, and then it stopped pursuing him. When I saw that, and this guy was completely baffled as what this thing was doing, and he didn't understand, I promise you that Jane Goodall would recognize this behavior. The late Diane Fossey would especially recognize this behavior as territorialism, especially from a big male. Apes do what's known as a false charge. In fact, a lot of animals do. I know back last year there was a film that a hiker put out where he walked up on some mountain cougar cubs, and Mama showed up. What did she do? She walked toward him and walked him back the opposite way. And all of a sudden she would run and charge at him and stop. Run and charge at him and stop. The message is, move away from my young. You are close to my young, move. You are seen as a threat. So, and I'm willing to bet that this gentleman, and that that within maybe a few hundred yards, quarter of a mile at the most, there was probably, if this was real, there's probably a family of Sasquatch, and this was the big male protecting his mate and his young. Very much a primate behavior, because animals don't like to get into fights if they don't have to, and attack if they don't have to. Why? Because they will avoid it. They'll posture and all of this to avoid it, because they instinctively know if they get injured, they will die. That can lead to a painful death, or they can't go to the emergency room, folks. So they kind of avoid that. So they make a lot of threats and a lot of posturing, and that's what, and especially with apes, they'll charge, the famous beating the chest, and charge and growl and scream, and then stop. they will attack if you don't take the hit. But if you start moving away, they'll just keep doing that till they get you where you want. And that's exactly what this thing was doing. So when I saw and I read that, I'm like, oh my God, that is pure primate behavior. And this poor guy it was a horror film to him. He had no idea what was going on. Of course, this thing could have twisted his head off if it wanted to. It overtook him quickly with that larger leg span, but it didn't. So that's one case to me that that kind of points that there's something to this Bigfoot thing. Now, the other thing kind of going against it is that we do know that a lot of these footprints and sightings are hoaxes and fakes. For instance, Fred Beck, one of the gentlemen that was in the Ape Canyon later on, told wild stories about being abducted by aliens and a lot of other fantastical stories. Albert Ostman really didn't, the man said to have been kidnapped by the Bigfoot. He really didn't tell this story for over 24 years later, and he told it when the Bigfoot story started coming out. Now, it could have been the kind of a Me Too effect where, he thought people would think he was crazy, and then when people started seeing it and the Bigfoot reports come out, he felt safe to tell this story. But a lot of Bigfoot investigators that interviewed him felt that he was more telling a big tale, and some of the things he said about that they ate sweet grass and all of this didn't really match primate behavior or Bigfoot behavior. So he may have just been telling a big tale. And even more with the tracks, there was a gentleman named Ray Wallace who just passed away in 2002, who confessed and even showed his prints of faking Bigfoot tracks from the 1950s up through the 70s and 80s, and even getting friends and we got very sophisticated with it, even getting hair from a buffalo or a bison and scattering them around, getting a car to pull him in a muddy area with these fake feet on, so he'd hold on to a rope, and when he'd pull him, he'd make these giant steps. He got pretty, and his carved footprints were pretty sophisticated. In fact, Wallace was working for the logging crew, was on the logging crew for where Jerry Crowe took the first prints, the famous first Bigfoot incident that made the Humboldt Times. Ray Wallace was on that crew, and looking at the prints taken by Jerry Crowe, the foreman that made the newspapers, I think they're most definitely part of Ray Wallace's prank. However, it doesn't rule it completely, and a lot of people think that he's the one that started Bigfoot, and in a way he did, because if these first prints were a prank by him, that's what we got the Bigfoot name and the legend starts up. But that doesn't knock out the other evidence, such as the Mossberg track of a crippled individual, which he wouldn't have been capable of faking or even in that area, as well as the dermal ridges, and also a lot of the footprints, when you follow them, the toes will move and grip, which is very natural. If they're all just the same exact identical print, it's looking at a fake. But when the toes spread or the grip and all this, as a natural foot does, that requires some sort of special made foot that mechanical foot that you could change all that, and it doesn't seem likely. And there's no sign that he made something like that. So Ray Wallace doesn't really kill the legend, but we definitely know that he faked a lot of the tracks. And then you get down to the famous Patterson-Gimlin film, the Holy Grail of Bigfoot evidence. Well, it's been a lot of speculation about it from the very beginning. And to be quite frank, Roger Patterson, who died in 1972 from cancer, was a little bit of a shady character. They said he didn't like to work. He kind of did odd jobs here and there. He was always looking for a gimmick, an invention, or something like that to make money. He knew a lot of people, so it wasn't outside of his character, I don't think, to have faked this thing. But then you come down to the suit. Who made that? That's never been actually answered. And he did swear to his deathbed that this was true, and not only that he even took a polygraph and passed it with flying colors. But however, there is a man named Bob Hieronymus, who was a friend of Robert Gimlin, the other gentleman that was with him, and Roger Patterson. And in fact, we know that one of the horses they were riding that day belonged to Bob Hieronymus. There's that. And Bob claims that he was the man in the suit, that they had offered him $1,000 to do this, and that Roger produced the suit. I would give him the suit to put on. And that they never paid him the $1,000. He stayed silent about it anyway, and then he finally revealed it. Now, there's no proof that he's telling the truth. He's never produced the suit. Some of his stories about the suit don't match. He said that the mask was made out of an old-fashioned leather football helmet. That doesn't work. And that the suit would look like it's made out of horsehide. That one look at that suit, you can tell that's not sewed together a horsehide by a cowboy. That was a professionally made suit if it was a suit. However, if you ever watch Bob Hieronymus, who's like 6'4", 6'5", would match, he has a very particular walk. And that walk is identical to the famous Bigfoot walk, which so many people said is a natural gait for a human, and there's been so many examinations of that walk. If you watch Bob Hieronymus walk, you get a little twinge because you realize you've seen that walk before, except it was something big and hairy walking along Bluff Creek. He has that peculiar walk, and even I can't I can't overlook that. No more proof for him being the Bigfoot in the film than not, but it is something to consider. Also, I have to consider as far as Roger Patterson's character. One thing is that there was a warrant for his arrest put out because he didn't return the film camera that he had rented when he that he used to film this Bigfoot. That's kind of the guy that Roger Patterson was. However, Robert Gimlin, his friend, who was there with him, and the main witness, who said is always maintained that what this film, the account and what he saw was real. And Robert Gimlin is always been, he doesn't like publicity. In fact, only in the last decade or so has he started coming out to Bigfoot conventions and things like that. Before that, for decades, he avoided the limelight. He did not like it. He was always he has a great reputation and a great character. Is just a good old-fashioned workaday cowboy, with very high principles, very good reputation, and he has maintained and still maintains that this absolutely was true, and that him standing by it had caused a lot of problems in his life, almost caused his wife to divorce him, and that's the reason he hid from the limelight for decades. So, but now there's been said, did Roger fool Bob? Did he have somebody waiting out there and this was a stage thing? That has been proposed. I find that hard to believe. But, I'm going to go into all this more in the Patterson-Gimlin film. Now, all this been said, all the pros and the cons, do I think that there is such a thing as Bigfoot? Is there such a thing as Sasquatch? Well, I stay on the fence on it, and which I think is a good place to be, because I know a lot of anthropologists, where I'm a professor myself, I've known a lot of anthropologists, you bring it up, they dismiss it right away, completely. You bring this up, I find that they haven't even read it or read about Gigantopithecus and the dermal ridges, so they just automatically dismiss it, and that's bad science. You don't dismiss something, and it's true, you can't say it exists, but you shouldn't be able to dismiss it. That's not a good scientific method. You could look at the hypothesis of it and then try to prove that hypothesis, and look at all the evidence, and they're not even willing to do that, and that's hard-headedness, and that's not science. Now, they are right, there is no proof, physical proof for this, and what we do have is rather circumstantial. But on the other side, they're like, we do have evidence, the footprints, the dermal ridges, the film, all the sightings, the consistency, and they're both right. And so I like to stay in between, and stay in that nice critical area that a scientist should stay within. Do I think it's a possibility? Is it impossible? Absolutely not. As like I said, Gigantopithecus and all these other things, it is not an impossibility that such a creature could exist, and not even impossible that it could, even though highly unlikely, they could stay hidden from us. Is there is there an argument that it doesn't exist? Of course, there is no bones, there is no fossils, no living specimen. You are talking about a 7 foot giant hairy beast living in a country of 300 million people. They should be seen more often. So there's arguments for both sides. I think there was one gentleman that said on Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday, Monday, Wednesday, and Friday I believe in Bigfoot. On Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday I don't, and on Sunday I rest. I agree with him. That's where I stand. Part of the time I think, yes, this thing has to be real. Other times I'm like, I don't see how it can exist. But I'll tell you what, I really hope that it does. And if it does, and we do eventually find one alive, I hope that we do the right thing. This would be an endangered species, and it should be treated that way. It should be protected. It should be studied, but it should be protected. It should, with harsh fines for disturbing them. Habitats should be protected. They should, because this would change the entire anthropological world, and this would have to be one of our cousins, our distant relative. Same as because this would have to be a primate, and and it would be the only other primate that is bipedal if it exists. So very close to us. So I don't know if it exists, but I hope that it does. Okay, folks, this has been a bit of a long first video, and I hope that you enjoyed it. And hey, if you're enjoying my material, and please hit this little purple chair and give me a join. Also give me a like. I'd also love to hear anything you know about Bigfoot. If you had an experience, I want to hear about it. So hit me up below and let and tell me your story, and tell me whether you think Bigfoot exists or not. I'd love to have the conversation with you. And also, don't forget, I have my other channel, Big Pretty Man, where I go over all this material for extra large men so they can live large and in charge. So until next time, find yourself a good chair, get yourself a good book, and follow your passions. Later.